Tommy Lynn Sells. Known infamously as the Coast-to-Coast Killer, his reign of terror spanned from the late 1980s through the early 1990s. Sells is linked to at least 13 murders, but the true extent of his carnage remains a dark mystery. He killed without remorse, often choosing his victims at random. The randomness of his killings added an extra layer of fear, as it seemed no one was safe from his grasp. The story of Tommy Lynn Sells is one of horror and tragedy. His actions left a permanent scar on the communities he terrorized, and his legacy continues to haunt the memories of those who survived his wrath. Tommy Lynn Sells was born into chaos. Born on June 28, 1964 in Oakland, California, Sells' life was far from stable. His mother, Nina Sells, was a single parent who struggled to provide for her children. From a young age, Sells was exposed to violence and dysfunction. Sells and his twin sister, Tammy Jean, were sent to live with their aunt in Missouri when they were just 18 months old. However, tragedy struck when Tammy Jean died of meningitis at the age of 3. This loss deeply affected Sells, who was already showing signs of emotional disturbance. He started running away from home at the age of 7, and by the time he was 10, he had begun using drugs and alcohol. His criminal activities escalated from petty theft to more serious offenses, including burglary and assault. The lack of a stable home environment and the early exposure to trauma and abuse undoubtedly contributed to Sells' development as a serial killer. As Tommy Lynn Sells entered adulthood, his violent tendencies only grew more pronounced. By the time he was in his 20s, Sells had already begun his murderous spree. His first known murder occurred in 1980 when he was just 16 years old. The victim was a 39-year-old man named Melvin Hardin, whom Sells killed during a burglary in Missouri. Sells continued to commit murders across various states, each more horrific than the last. His modus operandi varied, making it difficult for law enforcement to connect the dots. He used different weapons, including knives, guns, and blunt objects, and his victims ranged in age, gender, and background. One of the most chilling aspects of Sells' crimes was his willingness to kill children. In 1987, he murdered a 10-year-old boy named Joel Kirkpatrick in Illinois. Sells had broken into the boy's home and killed him in his sleep, an act of pure evil that shocked the community. The descent into violence for Tommy Lynn Sells was a gradual but inevitable process. Tommy Lynn Sells' first known murders set the tone for what would become a long and gruesome career. In 1980, Sells claimed his initial victim, Melvin Hardin, during a burglary in Missouri. This murder was the beginning of a series of brutal killings that would span 2 decades. In 1985, Sells committed one of his most heinous acts when he killed a family of 4 in Ina, Illinois. The victims were Rory Dardine, his pregnant wife Elaine, and their 3-year-old son Peter. Sells bludgeoned Rory to death with a baseball bat before turning his attention to Elaine and Peter. Elaine was beaten so severely that she went into premature labor, and Sells then killed the newborn infant. Sells' ability to evade capture after committing such brutal crimes is a testament to his cunning and adaptability. He would often move to a new state after each murder, making it difficult for law enforcement to track him. The murders of the Dardine family were a wake-up call to the nation. Section 5. A horrific pattern unfolds. As the years went by, a horrific pattern began to emerge. Tommy Lynn Sells was not just a serial killer. He was a predator who thrived on chaos and fear. His crimes spanned multiple states, including Missouri, Illinois, Texas, and Arizona, among others. Each new murder added to the growing sense of dread that surrounded his name. The random nature of his killings meant that anyone could be a target, and this unpredictability made him all the more terrifying. Sells abducted Stephanie Mahaney from her home in Springfield, Missouri, and took her to a secluded location where he raped and strangled her. Her body was later found in a nearby river, a stark reminder of the horrors that Sells was capable of. Sells' victims were often chosen at random, but the brutality of his crimes was always consistent. The pattern of violence that defined Sells' career was not just about the physical acts of murder. It was also about the psychological torment he inflicted. Section 6. The unverified claims of over 70 murders. Tommy Lynn Sells was a man of many contradictions. While he was undoubtedly responsible for a significant number of murders, he also claimed to have killed over 70 people. These claims have been met with skepticism by law enforcement and criminal experts alike. While it is clear that Sells was a prolific killer, the exact number of his victims remains uncertain. His tendency to exaggerate and fabricate details has made it difficult to separate fact from fiction. Sells' claims of over 70 murders are both chilling and perplexing. On one hand, it is entirely possible that he committed more murders than those officially attributed to him. On the other hand, Sells had a tendency to seek attention and may have inflated his body count to enhance his notoriety. The true extent of Sells' murderous activities may never be known, leaving a dark cloud of uncertainty over his legacy. Section 7. The Texas Incident. The beginning of the end. The beginning of the end for Tommy Lynn. Sells came in December 1999 in Del Rio, Texas. Sells broke into the home of Kayleen Harris, a 13-year-old girl, with the intent to kill. He brutally attacked her, slashing her throat and leaving her for dead. However, miraculously, Kayleen survived the attack and was able to identify her assailant. This brave act of survival would ultimately lead to Sells' capture and the end of his killing spree. Kayleen's survival and subsequent identification of Sells were pivotal moments. Her ability to provide a detailed description of her attacker gave law enforcement the break they needed. Sells was arrested on January 2, 2000, and charged with attempted murder. The Texas incident was a turning point in the hunt for Tommy Lynn Sells. Section 8. The Capture and Confession. Once in custody, Tommy Lynn Sells began to confess to a series of murders that spanned over 2 decades. His confessions were chilling in their detail and revealed a mind consumed by violence and depravity. Sells showed little remorse for his actions, often describing his crimes with a disturbing level of detachment. His willingness to confess to so many murders was both a blessing and a curse for investigators, who now had the daunting task of verifying his claims. Sells's confessions provided a wealth of information about his methods and motives. He described how he would choose his victims at random, often targeting those who were most vulnerable. Despite his willingness to talk, Sells remained an enigma, with many of his claims still unverified. The confessions were a critical step in the process of bringing Sells to justice. They provided closure for many of the families who had lost loved ones to his violence. Section 9. The Trial and Sentencing. The trial of Tommy Lynn Sells was a highly publicized event that captivated the nation. Held in Valverde County, Texas, it was an opportunity for the families of his victims to see justice served. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including Sells's own confessions, to build a compelling case against him. The trial also featured emotional testimonies from survivors and the families of the victims who recounted the horrors they had endured. In October 2000, Tommy Lynn Sells was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. The verdict was met with a sense of relief and closure for the families of his victims. The sentencing marked the end of Sells' reign of terror and ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent person. The trial and sentencing of Sells were significant, not just for the families of his victims, but for the nation as a whole. Section 10. Execution and Legacy. On April 3, 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. His execution marked the end of a long and tortuous journey for the families of his victims. For many, it was a moment of closure, a final chapter in a nightmare that had spanned decades. Sells showed little remorse in his final moments, maintaining his cold and detached demeanor until the very end. The legacy of Tommy Lynn Sells is one of horror and tragedy. He left a trail of devastation across the United States, affecting countless lives. His crimes have become a dark chapter in American criminal history, serving as a stark reminder of the potential for evil that exists within some individuals. The impact of his actions will be felt for generations, as the families of his victims continue to cope with their loss. Sells' execution also highlighted the importance of the criminal justice system in holding individuals accountable for their actions.